Welcome. My name is Danny, and I'm the Director of Programs here at the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation. And I'm going to play a quick little promo video we have for this November speaker series and give people another minute to join. All right, there's a short little promo of some upcoming events that we have. And yeah, 6:01, so let's go ahead and get started here. I just want to spend a moment to thank you all for taking your Wednesday night to come and joining us and learning about this incredible story about one immigrant's family's fight for their civil liberties in an era of discrimination and racially targeted legislation. I know we're in the middle of this very tight election, and results are still too close to call. But whatever happens, I just would like everyone to think about how many people came out to vote, and really a record-breaking number of 159.8 million Americans. So that's really an important achievement. And as Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation, we as an organization, a history-focused institution, we like to shed light on stories that might not get a lot of attention that would truly deserves. And so we're actually very lucky to secure this grant from the Griffith Foundation to present 3 lecture series focused on the advancements of archaeology and preservation of Asian American places. And tonight's program is a really incredible one, and it showcases one family's fight for their right to pursue the American dream. And Lisa Masengale is going to be our speaker, and we like to thank her for her participation. She is the Curator of Historic Structures for the City of Riverside's Museum Department. Formerly, she worked at California State Parks in Monterey and the Living Computer Museum in Seattle. Lisa earned her bachelor's in archaeology and a master's in archaeology of buildings at the University of York in the UK. She also previously worked in the curatorial departments of the National Mining Hall of Fame and Museum in Leadville, Colorado, and the Gaston County Museum of Art and History in Dallas, North Carolina. She is a specialist in historic preservation of museum buildings and preventative conservation, along with curating, housekeeping, and creative pest management for historic sites. So a lot there, and we're super lucky to have her join us. We'll have a Q&A after the talk too, so if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box so we can moderate that. If everyone's here, we got 22 people, so wonderful turnout. Thanks again for joining us tonight. Lisa, whenever you're ready.
All right, is everyone able to see that PowerPoint okay and hear me okay?
Yep, we see you loud and we hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. Again, thank you so much for having me today. It is our great honor at the Museum of Riverside to share the Harada House story. And personally, the Harada House is my baby. It is the reason I took the job with the Museum of Riverside 2 years ago. So it is my honor to share the story further. You'll notice throughout the talk, I get very emotional about the Harada House. It's been 2 years that I've been working with the house, and it still moves me to tears on a almost daily basis. I very much connect on a deep emotional level with the Harada family story, and I hope that others will as well. So just a little bit of background on the Museum of Riverside. As mentioned, we are a department within the city of Riverside. We have under our stewardship 4 different historic sites. We have the Harada House, We have the Robinson House, which is directly next door to the Harada House. It's the little cottage to the left in this photo. We also have our main flagship building, which is on Mission Avenue, just across the street from the Mission Inn, and that is a 1912 former federal post office. And our last site is where I'm speaking from today. It is our 1891 Victorian House Museum, which is across town, closer to CBU. Harada House, we've had for 17 years under our care, but 2020 is definitely by far the best year for Harada House. It has been a terrible year by all counts for everyone else, but Harada is finally getting positive attention and really good steps towards its rehabilitation. So we were very honored to receive the $500,000 Save America's Treasures grant, which we're currently fundraising the match for, as well as being named to the National Trust's 11 Most Endangered list for 2020. So those are very big accomplishments for Harada House. So the house and the other houses on its block were all built approximately in 1884. Harada House was actually one of three essentially identical small single-story structures that were built. The Harada House and its two twins are to the right, and then Robinson House was built around the same time, directly to the left. In this photo, you can see a little glimpse of it. And the house was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1990. The only other National Historic Landmark in Riverside is the Mission Inn, which is just a couple blocks walk away from here. This is a residential street downtown. Originally, it had orange groves behind it. It's also within a historic district, the Heritage Square for the city of Riverside. It's a city landmark. It's about to be formalized as being a state landmark as well. So I'm going to talk really about the family story for the first 2/3 because the significance of the house is really inseparable from the story of the family and what this home meant to them and really how it was a touchstone throughout their lives. So Ken and Jukichi Harada were both born in the 19th century in Japan. Jukichi came from a line of school teachers and Ken from a line of samurai. Their courtship and marriage was very unusual at the time in that it was not an arranged marriage through their family. They met through a friend of Jukichi's, fell in love, and got married. So not the typical story. Jukichi, very early on, was not satisfied with being a school teacher in Japan. It was a respectable but modest lifestyle, and he wanted more. He, as his children said, wanted to seek his fortunes and better fortunes and more adventures. So not long after he married Ken and she was pregnant, he left for the United States in 1898. He arrived in San Francisco and very soon after signed up to be part of the galley crew for a ship supporting the U.S. Navy in the Spanish-American War. He served on several different U.S. ships before getting into a very scary racist situation and going back to Japan in 1902, which is when he finally got to meet his son, Masuatsu. When the family was reunited, they took this family portrait to commemorate the event in 1903. It's a great photo because it shows that mix of Japan and California with the family, where Ken and Masuatsu are in more of their traditional Japanese clothing, although Masuatsu has a little hat on, and Jukichi is very much his California suit and his California attire influencing his demeanor. And I also sort of like the way that Masuatsu is leaning into his mom. He didn't know his dad very well at this point, having just met him. Now, Jukichi, soon after this portrait was taken, went back to the United States. It would be his final journey to U.S. He would not go back to Japan ever again. In fact, pretty much stayed mostly in California afterwards. Ken, at this point, when Jukichi left in 1903, she was pregnant again with a daughter. So that delayed her joining her husband very unfortunately, their daughter died as an infant in Japan. It took Ken some time to then prepare to come to the United States. It didn't go well when she was turned away at Angel Island because she had an eye infection. There was nothing dangerous about it, but they would not let her into the United States. So she left Masuatsu with his father, who again was pretty much a stranger to them, to his father. But she went back to Japan, and she finally successfully made it to California in 1905. They moved to Redlands, and then very soon after moved to Riverside. Ken and Jukichi got jobs in the Golden State Restaurant, which was owned by a fellow Japanese entrepreneur. And then they started saving up money, and they invested in boarding houses. So they leased houses and then rented out the rooms for a profit. That's also where they lived at the time. And by 1910, they had saved up enough money that they were able to take over ownership and operation of the Washington Restaurant in downtown Riverside. The restaurant had opened around 1909. They took over, we think, around 1910. They kept the name, the theme of George Washington, which Jukichi really embraced. He decorated the interior with many portraits of American presidents, and by all accounts was a very patriotic person who was very, very, very proud to be in the United States and very much loved sort of all things Americana. 1913, 1 year after this photo was taken of the Washington Restaurant, California passed the Alien Land Law of 1913. And this ensured that those immigrants who were ineligible for U.S. citizenship could not purchase property in California. So Ken and Jukichi, as well as their son Masuatsu, were all born in Japan. They were ineligible for U.S. citizenship. That law would not change until the 1950s, which was rather too late for them. And so by default, then they could not own any property in the United States in California either. So meanwhile, though, they had the great joy of having their first son born in the United States. So the first U.S. citizen, Tadao, was born in 1907. Seems to have been the apple of his daddy's eye. Jukichi, of course, and Ken, of course, loved all of their children, but particularly to Jukichi, to have a U.S. citizen son was very, very significant to him. It meant a tremendous amount. He was very close with Tadao. At this point, they were still living in a room in the boarding houses that they operated. And unfortunately, Tadao got very sick very suddenly. He had diphtheria, and in a matter of hours, he went from essentially being a healthy 5-year-old to not being able to breathe, and he died in Jukichi's arms in the middle of the night. Tadao's death was very, very devastating for the family, but especially for Jukichi. Jukichi was bound and determined he had to provide a safer, healthier environment for his children. He could not continue to let this happen for his family. He had already lost 2 children now. Losing his daughter as an infant, was one thing, but losing a 5-year-old son was something else entirely. And it made him absolutely determined he was going to get a single family home in a nice neighborhood to raise his children where they could be happy, healthy, and safe. So in 1915, he spotted an advertisement that Mr. Noble was a lawyer and a real estate agent. Jukichi spotted his ad in the newspaper, and it was for a house on Lemon Street. Lemon Street was a perfect location for the Harada family. It was in downtown Riverside. It was very walkable, very close to the children's schools, to their church, to their restaurant. It was really perfect for his family. And it was in a really nice middle-class white neighborhood. So it was everything Jukichi was looking for his family to provide that better life. So he contacted Mr. Noble. Of course, there were some complications. Mr. Noble knew the law of 1913. He knew Jukichi and Ken could not buy the house. But Jukichi had a plan. He said, no, it's fine. I have 3 children who are U.S. citizens, Mine, Sumi, and Yoshizo. They may be toddlers, but they're US citizens, and the house will be purchased in their name for them. The other issue was that the Gunnarsons who owned the house were not particularly keen to sell to Japanese American family. The Gunnarsons were what we would consider house flippers today. They had just purchased the house on Lemon Street a couple of months prior, painted it, put in some new wallpaper, and then were trying to sell it for a profit. Noble ended up being able to negotiate a pretty good price of $1,500. The Gunnarsons decided, okay, fine, decent profit on their investment, they would sell. But Noble, just to cover his bases and make sure that he was doing his due diligence, he wrote to the California Attorney General and asked, was it legal, was it okay for the house to be purchased in the names of the 3 children? And the California Attorney General wrote back quite quickly and said, yes, there was nothing illegal about US citizens, despite their age, buying property, owning property in California. It was not illegal. So with this letter in hand, the transaction went through and the house was purchased by the Haradas, more specifically by the little tiny children, Mine, Sumi, and Yoshizo, in December 1915. There was a complication, though, and that was the neighbors. Cynthia Robinson, who was going to be their next door neighbor, was not happy, to put an understatement on it. She lived in a white neighborhood. She wanted to continue living in a white neighborhood, and she raised the alarm of many of the other neighbors, some of whom were quite politically important, and they formed a committee to basically stop the Haradas from moving in. They offered Jukichi more than the family paid for the house just to make them go away. Jukichi's response was quite forceful, and he said, I won't sell. You can murder me. You can throw me into the sea, and I won't sell. So that was a no. And so the neighbors continued to fume and have a bit of a fuss, but there was nothing at this point legally that they could do. Jukichi, again, bound and determined that this was the plan for his family. This was how he was going to keep his children healthy and safe. In January of 1916, a couple weeks after closing on the house, he hired a contractor. He hired the contractor to add a second story to the house, essentially creating the house as it looks still today. And he also hired the contractor to do foundation repairs because Jukichi noted at the time that there was water flowing underneath the house. A foundation issue in 1915 is quite important. I'll talk more about our foundation problems later. But it's safe to say that in the 105 years since they bought the house, the foundation issues have not improved. And it's actually one of our greatest problems of instability with the home. Now, the neighbors, being pretty politically savvy and knowing people in high places, made enough of a fuss that they convinced the Attorney General, despite already having him say in writing nothing was illegal, they convinced him to have the state of California file a lawsuit against the Harada family with the intent to take the house away from them. So the lawsuit was filed about 10 months after they purchased the house in late October, or in October of 1916. This case made not just local headlines, not just national headlines, but international headlines. This was a very big deal because it was really the first test of this law. And there was a lot of concern that this would set a legal precedent that would be dangerous to white property ownership rights and not set the precedent that people wanted in California and in the United States. The newspapers made such a fuss about the case that they claimed that Japan, the government, was watching the case, and that if the Japanese government did not like the outcome, that they would actually declare war on the United States. Of course, that sounds a bit silly, but that was how big this case was, that the press was actually making those kinds of outlandish claims. Now, the trial dragged on for 2 years, but in 1918, in September of that year, in Riverside Superior Court, in our historic courthouse that is still in downtown today, Judge Hugh Craig ruled in favor of the Haradas. The laws that was written did not stop the Harada children from owning the house, no matter how young they were. And so this is the moment when everyone breathes a sigh of release. You know, social justice was achieved, and the Haradas got to keep their home. The Harada family continued to grow. Now, do note, they had another tragedy in the family prior to being able to purchase the house in 1915. They had lost another daughter as an infant. But when they purchased the house and did the renovations, Ken was already pregnant with little Clark. He was born in 1916, not long after the house was renovated. Harold was actually born in the house, in the front bedroom downstairs, just to the left of the front door in 1923. And then Roy was adopted by the family in 1928. He's actually the only family member on the screen that is still alive today. So if you're doing the math, yes, Roy is 101 years old, which is pretty remarkable. Again, the family continued to grow and to prosper. Ken and Jukichi encouraged their sons to attend university. Masuatsu, who's in the middle back row there, and by this point had his own family, he became a surgeon. Yoshizo, who is in the front row on the left there, he became a dentist. And then little Harold, who's the little boy on his daddy's lap on that far right front row, he also became a dentist later after World War II. Now, of course, World War II happens, and that is another point of devastation for the Harada family. Pearl Harbor happens, the executive orders happened. The family was forced to register with the impending evacuation, as they called it. Of course, we now call it the forced removal. The family forced to sell their home. They were forced to sell it they were forced to sell the restaurant for a tremendous loss. But they were able to keep the home. Oops, are you still able to see my PowerPoint? Okay. So I'm having a little technical glitch over here. So they were forced to sell the Washington restaurant for a loss, but they were still able at this point to keep their home on Lemon Street. Now, Harold and Sumi were the two children that were still living at home with their parents in 1942. By this point, Ken and Jukichi were not in great health. Ken in particular had strokes and was not doing very well. So it was Harold and Sumi that were really running the restaurant at this point. They sent their parents away to other family in anticipation of this forced removal. So when Harold and Sumi were forcibly removed, it occurred at 7 a.m. on May 23rd, 1942. We know that because Harold wrote in pencil on a bedroom wall upstairs. It's a very famous inscription that's associated with the house. But it was also written on a calendar that was downstairs in the laundry room. The family was actually separated and split up. I mean, it's a fairly large family, and at this point, they were living in a few different areas of California. But they were sent to Tule Lake in California, Post in Arizona, and Topaz in Utah. Sumi and several of her brothers were sent to Poston. Her parents were sent to Topaz. Now, Jess Stebler stepped in when the family was forcibly removed. He was a white bachelor in Riverside and a very dear friend. And he moved into the house on Lemon Street. He also took over their other business affairs. They had income properties, so he started collecting the rents from the tenants in those income properties. The Harada family had all of their insurance policies canceled because insurance companies would not insure Japanese Americans at this point. So Jess Stebler secured all of the necessary insurance policies. He looked after the house, and he also tried to keep up Sumi's spirits. So he wrote her on a very regular basis. We are extremely fortunate at the museum that we have his collection of letters to Sumi in our collection. He would write her everything about what was happening in wartime Riverside, updates on the house. He would try to cheer up by telling her that her flowers were blooming, which fruits were becoming ripe at the house. He handed all of her business affairs and kept her informed about what's happening with tenants, when tenants were late with rent and why, all of that. And he also sent her critical supplies. He would send her frivolous things like donuts, just try to cheer up the family in the camp. But he would also send food and supplies and tools that the family hadn't been able to take with them and that they needed in the camps and couldn't otherwise obtain. One of his letters that breaks my heart the most, he wrote right after Ken Harada died. Now, Ken Harada and Jukichi Harada, when they were brought to the Topaz U.S. concentration camp, were admitted into the camp hospital because they were in very poor medical condition. Sumi and her brothers petitioned to be transferred to Topaz from Poston so they could be closer to their ailing parents. Initially incarcerated in 1942, they were successful in transferring in 1943. They immediately went to the hospital to visit Ken. Within a couple of hours of their arrival, she had a devastating stroke and she died the next morning. And within a couple of days, Jess wrote this letter to Sumi asking if there was any marker on her mother's grave so that she would be able to find the gravesite again. So that is one of those sobering moments that makes you realize what life must have been like as a Japanese American forcibly removed and incarcerated during World War II. I mean, it makes me very emotional to think about just the idea of, yes, someone having to ask you, like, how will you ever find where your mom is buried again? Jukichi died in the same hospital 1 year later in the Topaz camp, officially dying of heart failure. Now, in 1944, Sumi was allowed by the War Relocation Authority to leave the Topaz concentration camp and to relocate, as they called it, to Chicago, which is deemed to be an appropriate location for Japanese Americans to resettle. Again, one of the words that the U.S. government used at the time. So in 1945, the federal government decided that Japanese Americans could finally return to the West Coast. And so Sumi made arrangements and Jess Stabler prepared for her arrival back in Riverside. He actually cautioned her not to come back right away because he was concerned about her safety. And he thought maybe some of her brothers should come back from the war first. But she did come back to the house alone. And a local pastor that she knew contacted her and asked her if she would open up the home to other Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated to help them get back on their feet, because she was very unusual in that she had a home to return to. So she did. She opened the house as a boarding house. Most of the people that came to live with her, she had actually known from Poston. There were other families she had known there. And they would typically stay with her for a couple of months while they found work and new living situations. There's evidence of this still inside the house today in the downstairs bathroom. There's a very weathered note that indicated to the boarders which towels were clean on the rack and then where to put their dirty towels so that she could take care of them. And the photo on the bottom right is a very unusual photo for us. And we do not have very many photos taken inside the house. And that is Sumi Harada inside the Harada House kitchen shortly after her return from Chicago. Sumi stayed at the house for the rest of her life until very near the end of her life when she was forced into a nursing facility. She kept the house pretty much the way it was when her parents lived there. She updated some of the appliances necessary, but otherwise the house was very much frozen in time. People did leave things with her. Family members, her brothers, for instance, left some of their war-related memorabilia. Some of the families that boarded with her left mementos with her that they no longer wanted of their pre-war life. And Sumi really, I say this with love, but Sumi Harada became a hoarder. It's actually a known phenomenon seen in incarcerated Japanese Americans after World War II. You can imagine if everything's been taken away from you, afterwards you don't want to get rid of anything that you have. And so Sumi kept everything. She kept everything that was in the house when she came back from the war, and she never really got rid of anything in the decades afterwards. Everything from, I mean, we have dozens and dozens of just unwrapped gifts even that she was given that she never even opened, and we don't actually know what's inside. There was some disrepair, of course, as well, that happened. Sumi lived in the house until about 1998 when she suffered a fall, and then she went into a Los Angeles facility until she died in 2000. The house stayed with the family until 2003. After Harold died, the Harada family donated the house to the city along with all of its contents. These are some photos that were taken at the time, and you can sort of see this sort of frozen in time aspect, but with the sort of time-worn finishes. The plaster at this point was already very badly deteriorating. The historic wallpaper was deteriorating, as well as the historic floor finishes. Just, you know, the sort of typical deferred maintenance that you see when you don't have a lot of financial means for upkeeping the home, maybe as well as that you would like. So when the house was acquired by the museum, the staff did not have time to sort through things. So they literally just boxed up everything. They took incredible care with writing down the location where everything came from. So all of the boxes I have tell you the exact room, the exact piece of furniture, and the drawer or shelf that every item came from. But truly, it is everything indiscriminately. So I am sorting through the collections right now, separating the trash from the treasure. And when I say trash, I'm not being unkind. We truly do have things like 1990s used toothpicks and dirty styrofoam takeout containers that are not historically significant. I don't see any interpretive value to them. The period of significance for the house is 1915 to 1946, essentially them acquiring the house through that immediate post-war period of returning from incarceration. And so that's the focus for the collections. We are keeping some significant materials from the decades past, but things like 1990s phone bills and newspaper advertisements that have no historical relevance, the toothpicks, the styrofoam containers, random modern things that are broken that not so much keeping probably. Ever since we acquired the house, we have been doing emergency stabilization. We haven't had the money to do the rehabilitation until now. And so it's been a lot of sort of stopgap measures. That bottom right photo shows you again some of the plaster damage from when the house was acquired in 2003. And that top left photo shows you an idea of what the house looks like inside today. I call it the buttressing. The entire house is essentially buttressed on the exterior and the interior to hold it together and to hold the finishes together. Our historically important, our character defining plaster and wallpaper finishes, as well as the whole house itself, is basically being held together with plywood sheathing and 2x4s and structural supports on the interior and the exterior, all designed by our structural engineer until we can start phase 1 of our rehabilitation. And it's holding together quite well. We had a series of earthquakes last year that had an epicenter just 10 miles away, but it is holding together very well, all things considered. One of the biggest projects that I've done to date on this, and it was the first project I started, was the historic siding. Shortly before I got here, I arrived in 2018 in late September, so just over 2 years ago. The structural engineers needed some siding removed on the exterior to check the structural stability and condition of some of the structural members. When they started removing siding, they realized they didn't need a little siding removed, they needed all of it removed and all of the trim removed. So everything was very carefully removed and labeled, as you can see in that photo on the left. Meticulously labeled, and then it was all just piled in Robinson House inside. And so when I got here, I needed to save every single piece. This is a character defining feature. We are saving literally everything from the siding, but prepare it for long-term storage in our collections offsite storage facility until it can someday go back on the house. At least that's the plan. So for those of you who maybe ever bought Pop-Tarts or crackers and they've come in that little vacuum sealed silver pouch, that's kind of like what we did with the siding. There's a silver material called Marble Seal. It is a food grade material, but it's an archival grade material. And we basically created custom made heat sealed silver foil packets for every piece of siding. The supplier thought I was insane when I told him we were encapsulating an entire house in these little custom made enclosures, because they're not just small pieces like you see on the screen there. Some of them are full size siding boards that are like 20 plus feet long. Some of them are more than 20 feet long. But it took us a lot of time, but they were all encapsulated and they're now safely in storage, awaiting someday when they can go back on the house. That top right photo is one of my favorite pieces of siding, because it clearly has a history there. That's not what I expect when I look at siding on a home. It has not only a lot of paint layers, but it actually had historic wallpaper on there as well. So you can see there was some reuse happening over time. Monitoring is very important for all of our historic sites. I emphasize that every site needs to have a full interior and exterior walkthrough at least once a week. But Harada gets inspected every time there's a storm, every time there's an earthquake, every time there's construction nearby or road work. This photo was taken last week during a windstorm here. That is the neighbor's jacaranda tree that went down. We were very fortunate where it fell. It missed all of the buildings and the power lines, and missed all people. It unfortunately did not miss the neighbor's car, which was totaled, but we feel very fortunate in this instance. I'm also constantly monitoring for plaster loss. Again, every time there's an earthquake, every time there's jackhammering down the street, I'm checking for plaster loss. On that left photo, you can just see some really small plaster fragments on the floor after an earthquake. Tend to not really get too concerned until the plaster fragments are the size of your iPhone or larger, and then I get a little more nervous. The sheathing and the supports are doing a pretty good job of temporarily holding things together, but we do have issues where we've had water infiltration. So that photo on the right, you can see, hopefully that's water on the floor there. I'll talk more about our tenting in a moment, but that photo was taken in March of this year after we sustained roof damage during tenting. The house is now tarped. It was tarped in March, and we're actually having a drone come examine the tarp for us from above next week to see what kind of condition it's in, if it's holding up or if we need to re-tarp before our rainy season. But water is always one of my great fears with our historic structures. And then I mentioned tenting. So all that plywood sheathing that you saw in those earlier photos that's holding the house together and the historic finishes together had hitchhikers come in with it when it was installed in the house. Really common. It's why you usually tent a house after you do any major work and bring in modern materials. In this case, not just termites, because that would have been too easy. We had wood-boring beetles. Unfortunately, it takes years to notice when you get this kind of damage. So I noticed late last year that we were getting frass in the house, which looks kind of like sawdust. It is the excrement of the wood-boring critters. So we had wood-boring beetles, unfortunately. It's a lot harder to kill them, but we did tent the house for the beetles, as well as getting rid of all of our termites in March of this year. Fortunately, though, because the roof was very brittle, everywhere that the tenting crew stepped, it damaged the roof, and then we got a lot of leaks in a storm the following week. So again, I mentioned that Sumi kept everything. So again, we are just sorting through everything and still trying to figure out what we have. I'm still discovering new things that we don't know we have in the collection. Just this week, I found a portrait of Tadao in one of the boxes that hadn't been reopened yet. And Tadao is, of course, so important to the family story. And I didn't know we had this portrait of him. We didn't have very many images of him. So that was incredibly exciting find. We recently found their Christmas decorations. So they had tons and tons of beautiful antique Christmas ornaments. That to me, I just imagine the Harada children decorating their Christmas tree in their home. And it's just really fun planning what artifacts will go back in the house, and what exhibitions we can host next door at Robinson House in our interpretive center, and then what sort of offsite exhibitions we can have as well. We are doing a rehabilitation of the house with an eye towards preservation. We want the house to feel as if the Harada family still lives there. And when you're visiting, like they have just stepped away and they could come back at any time. So last year, I did develop our interim interpretive plan as well in consultation with our stakeholders. A number of years ago, there was also a tour that you can drive or walk through for Japanese American history in Riverside that was grant funded. You can still get a copy of that today. And then as part of our interpretive plan, I revived our Instagram. So please do follow us on Instagram at the Museum of Riverside. And I feature a lot of excerpts from Jess's letters, but just all sorts of other interesting collections, materials, and things that really help tell the Harada story. Every once in a while I throw something in from one of our other sites, but it's pretty much the Harada Instagram that I focus on. And I mentioned our stakeholders. We are extremely fortunate that the Harada family is involved. Naomi Harada is in that left photo. She's on the far right. Naomi Harada is kind of like the Harada family spokesperson and representative. We also have the Harada House Foundation, which is our nonprofit partner, and other community members that are very involved and help guiding us for the decisions that we're making, the vision that we have. I'm happy that when I presented the idea of having the home feel as if they've just stepped away and that's going to be the museum experience, that's been very well received. So that's very exciting. Phase 1, yes, finally with the Save America's Treasures grant and those funds that we are matching 1-to-1, we can start Phase 1. Incredibly excited by this. After 17 years, it is finally happening. So Phase 1 focuses on the foundation stabilization. And the house is not level and plumb. We're going to address that. We're going to jack up the house, replace the foundation. We're going to replace critical structural members at this point, as well as in later phases. And we're going to stabilize the historic finishes, the plaster, the wallpaper, etc., so that they don't deteriorate further when we lift the house and we rebuild the foundation. So this is literally and metaphorically setting the foundation for our Phase 2 and Phase 3. And then by the end of it, after our hopefully $6.5 million project, we will have a house museum that can open to the public and really help tell what we think is a very important and compelling story of the Harada family. I mentioned Robinson House a couple of times. Directly next door. It was available in the market in 2014, and a fundraising effort raised the funds to purchase it for the museum. The express purpose of serving as an interpretive center for Harada House. So intention has always been this would be finished first and rehabilitated, again, according to the Secretary of the Interior standards. And then you could view the construction, the rehabilitation at Harada House next door, learn about it, have a whole interpretive center, a museum environment inside this house. Things have not gone according to plan. It seems to be a theme, unfortunately. Like Harada House, Robinson House has devastating foundation issues. I'm beginning to just think that the foundations maybe weren't built that great in the 1880s, and then termites got to them, and then that really, really caused a problem. This also has catastrophic structural damage throughout, as well as just bad structural alterations that were not to code. Subsequently happening, the plan to rehabilitate it is unfortunately now turned, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, to a reconstruction approach. So we are now going to be doing a Secretary of the Interior's reconstruction of the Robinson House. As it looks now, it has really lost its historic integrity. This looks nothing like Mrs. Robinson would recognize it or the Haradas would recognize it. We know from historic photographs that the Haradas took in their front yard. We can see in the background the Robinson House. So we will be reconstructing it to approximately 1930 appearance. Should be a lot more befitting to what Mrs. Robinson, the Haradas would recognize in terms of appearance. And then it will be the interpretive center inside. But from the front, by all accounts, it should look again, like a Victorian cottage. And the interior finishes, sadly, everything historic was lost decades ago. There was a unsympathetic alteration in the 1990s to change it to a duplex, which certainly didn't help the situation. So I see we have some questions. And again, if you have other questions you think of later, you have concerns, you have comments, please feel free to contact me or our museum director, Robin Peterson. If you have questions about how to donate, you can contact Robin or myself as well. There's actually 3 different ways that donations can be made to the Harada House. And of course, you can also visit the website for the Harada House Foundation, which is our nonprofit partner. They exclusively exist to fundraise for this project. And again, if you have any questions that you think of afterwards, please feel free to reach out to us. You can't tour the house because it is devastatingly unsafe, but you can drive by or you can walk by on the city sidewalk and see it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa. And if you can stop sharing your screen, we can go ahead and field some questions. But yeah, really a remarkable story and about this family perseverance through so many tragedies. It's really interesting to listen to. And it looks like you have your work cut out for you in trying to open the public. So we wish you the best of luck in that journey. So we have a question from Helen, who's actually a member of our Asian American History Committee here at the Trust. And she asks, what did Sumi do for money during all those years? Did she work outside the home?
Very good question. So Sumi tried to get a job when she returned to Riverside, and there was tremendous discrimination. No one would hire her. By the 1950s, she was able to get housekeeping jobs and babysitting jobs, those kinds of jobs. And she worked in that type of work through the 1970s. She was asthmatic and had some health issues. So by the 70s, she had to retire. And so she no longer worked after that. So finances were understandably very tight for her in her life.
Got it. Therese has a couple questions. She's actually the head of our Asian American History Committee, and she asks, where are Ken and Jukuchi buried?
So they're actually buried at Olive Wood Cemetery in Riverside. So to address Jess's question of could Sumi find her mother's grave again, Ken and Jukichi were actually cremated. And Sumi was given their cremated remains while she was in the Topaz camp. And she carried them with her to Chicago and then back to Riverside. And several years after she returned to Riverside, when all of the children could get together and the family could be reunited in Riverside, they had a burial ceremony and they buried their urns next to Tadao. So Ken and Jukichi were reunited with their little boy.
Oh, that's great. Teresa also asks, were there other Japanese families living in the neighborhood?
Not in their immediate neighborhood. And that was the problem. There was very much a Japanese American community that they were a part of in Riverside. There was their church, there was various associations. There was definitely a very strong Japanese American community here. But that immediate neighborhood was a white middle-class neighborhood, which is why it made it so attractive to Jukichi, but why they were also not welcome there. And I should sort of mention, it was so bad, the racism against the family during the lawsuit and afterwards, that Ken was terrified one of the neighbors would murder her children. So she thought the neighbors might try to poison the kids. And so she forbade them from ever taking food from strangers because she thought that it might be poisoned.
Wow. We have a question from Mike Mwali. He's actually the Trust's Associate Executive Director of Cultural Resources. And he asks, have any of the Harada House collections been digitized?
Very sporadically. Some things have been scanned. Some things have been scanned at higher resolution than others. Most of the things that have been scanned at a high resolution that we'd be happy with today was because they were for exhibition or publication. That's actually on the to-do list, is to re-inventory all of the archival and photographic collections and do proper scans of them. In the future, the plan is to make our collections available online. We're in the process of switching to TMS right now. And then through them, we will eventually have online collections. Right now, researchers can make requests. We're very limited with what we can accommodate, but that is in the plan someday.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a very time-consuming project,
Yes.
considering how much stuff they have. So Gloria asks, thank you very much for the interesting talk. I wonder what about Jeff Stadler, the friend who was so...
Oh, yes, Jeff Stadler. So, he didn't live a lot longer, I don't think. I don't remember what year he died. I don't really have a whole lot of information about what happened to him after he moved out of the house. That's sort of a good question. I should ask Mark and maybe the Harada family also. He kind of he has that really important part of the story, and then he sort of gets forgotten about in the narrative. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's something in the future we need to address, is more about our hero, Jess Stadler.
How do you spell that again?
Jess, so it's Jess, and then Stebler, Stebler. And I do know he has descendants. They've occasionally reached out to us on social media. So I think he has some nieces and nephews, but he never married and never had any children that we're aware of.
Therese asks, do the Haradas still have family in Japan?
That's a very good question. I'm not actually sure.
Yeah. Okay. And Ann Peterson is the executive director of the trust. Thanks for attending, Ann. She asks, if everything goes according to plan, when do you hope to open the house to the public?
That's a good question. We don't actually know.
Especially with COVID and everything too. Yeah.
Yeah, and COVID has not helped. We are about to go out to soon. In city timeline, soon we are going out to bid for architects to design the construction drawings for phase 1. And then after that, we'll have to bid out for the actual construction and then other professional services. So we're talking years. We're hoping to have Robinson House completed in several years. But the main Harada House rehabilitation is a long-term project.
So still to be determined.
Yes.
And Dan,
and depending on funding too.
Right. Dan Nishimura, the family's neighbors, are their stories being documented as well?
Oh, sorry, you cut out for a second there, Danny.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Dan asks about the Harada's family's descendants of the Harada family's neighbors. Are they still in the neighborhood?
Not that I know of. I don't actually have any information about that. That's a good avenue for research. I don't know. Okay. We should look into that.
Right. And he also has a follow-up. How aware is the neighborhood of the Harada family's story?
I don't know how much the neighbors necessarily are involved and invested emotionally. But I never cease to be amazed how much Riversiders are aware of the story. I am there all the time at the house, and I cannot tell you how many times I'm there that people come up to the house. You can tell it's very deliberate. A lot of times they're bringing a whole group of family or friends that probably are from out of town, and they stop in front of the house. Like, they have their Google map out. They stop there. They point to the house. They read the signage. They do some scrolling on their phone and look through it. A lot of times people burst into tears in front of the house. It never ceases to amaze me how emotional people get just standing on the sidewalk there, Googling it. And that happens really regularly. So there's definitely a shocking amount of, at least in Riverside, awareness that the house exists, which, I mean, is tucked down on a residential street. It may be only a couple of blocks from our tourist core of the Mission Inn, but people find it.
Yeah, that's great. Therese asks, what are the sources of your funding?
So it all has to be fundraised. It's not, the $6.5 million we need is not coming from the city of Riverside. It has to come from private donations and grants. So raising $6.5 million is definitely a challenge, but having that $500,000 grant from the Park Service is huge for us. That's what's getting us off the ground and running with phase 1. So that is why we are encouraging donations. now and in the future, because right now we basically have $6 million more that needs to be fundraised before we can open the house.
Right. And yeah, it's amazing how many primary sources you guys have and all those artifacts still intact and kept in such good condition. What would you say is like the most unique artifact that you've come across?
Oh my gosh. I mean, we have just so many random, interesting things. I know some of the museum staff are emotionally very attached to the family heirlooms that Ken brought from Japan. She brought various pieces with her. She brought kimonos and other very important family items with her. And she, just things like that. I just get really emotional about some of the everyday things. Like I found the other day Tootsie's dog license and collar and little dog tags. That was Sumi's dog when she came back from the war, and she had this cute little doggy who kind of reminds me of my dog. And just stuff like that, where you just get struck by sort of the everyday aspects of their lives. And you're like, oh gosh, this was a family just like you or I, but they went through these really, really horrible things because of the government and racism.
And I'm curious of the demographic of Riverside County during the early 1900s, because there was a kind of a Nihon Machi, right, at Japantown.
So we had several Chinatowns here, and that we had the Chinatown several here. We have the collection for Chinatown. The archaeological collection is actually in the museum, held by the museum. And then we did have a large Japanese American presence, and there was various, other the Bracero program and other things that happened later, and then various things that happened post-war, and during various sort of crises of worker shortages that happened as a result of the wars. So it's part of our long-term plans at the museum. Our main flagship museum is closed for renovation as well right now. And that got a little bit derailed, as you can imagine, by the pandemic. But in the future, there's a lot of exhibitions planned to really better explore that. We're also very fortunate that the Cheech museum is going to be opening directly across the street from our flagship museum. And then down the street is the Center for Social Justice, and that has its own museum facility that's opening as well. And then Mineo Kubo Center as well. They have a museum there. So there's a lot happening in regards to social justice and a lot of other issues, institutions that either are opening or have already opened here.
Mike has one last question. Speaking of every day, did they bring any ceramics from Japan? Are there any of their ceramics in your collections from the house?
So I haven't found anything that I know of right now that are ceramics brought from Japan. Is mostly clothing items and things like that, which is understandable because it was a sea voyage and Ken had to make it twice since she got turned away the first time. There's a ton of ceramics though from the house in the collection. I mean, if you imagine every ceramic that you acquire in a house over really like an 85-year period, because Sumi got rid of nothing, and I have broken dishes too, which I have kept. And we have things from the restaurant. So we have a number of materials that we have been able to trace from historic photographs that came from the Washington restaurant that later, when they stopped using at the restaurant, they took home. That's something that gets me really excited, is when I can find historic photographs and I can pick out artifacts we have in our collection. I can see them in a photo from the 19-teens with Jukichi in the restaurant, and I can see them in a family photo inside the house in maybe the 20s, and then I can see them in the backyard in the 1930s at the house. I get super giddy when I can trace those artifacts and see how they evolved in use with the family.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess we can start to wrap up. I know there was a post by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a very timely article, and also I was just doing some other research into the house. Sarah Mundy has a TEDx talk, if anyone else wants to watch that, and she was the City of Riverside's Director of Museums and Cultural Affairs Is she currently still working in that position? Or?
No, she's actually right now with the Harada House Foundation.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, great. No, that was an amazing talk. It's about 15 minutes long if anyone's curious. But yeah, besides following your Instagram, maybe making a donation, is there any other way our audience can support the cause?
And just, share awareness. If you have social media or you have other avenues, word of mouth is very important to us. A lot of people just get a very visceral connection. So we really appreciate just sharing the story. Again, checking us out on Facebook as well, sharing that. And then, depending on where you live, if you're more local to Riverside or not, talking to your local representatives. There is an effort to get funding from the state of California for the Harada House. Some of our representatives are trying to do that for us, and that would be very important to us. So we always appreciate, we've had, when we were up for the state landmark status, we actually had representatives from completely other areas of California speak to support us because their constituents made them aware of what was happening here and felt that it was very important statewide. So we always appreciate anything you can do to sort of spread the word about the Harada House and how important it is, not just locally, but statewide and nationally as well.
Yeah, definitely. So it's 7 o'clock. Definitely appreciate everyone's time, and yeah, if you have any questions, again, you have Lisa's information, and you can always reach out to us. You'll be also receiving a survey in your email, so we hope that you can give us some feedback. And also, if you're curious about any other virtual events, please check us out at sbthp.org. But Lisa, thanks again for giving us this wonderful little talk, and we hope to be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a great honor, and we greatly appreciate the museum.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Appreciate it. Take care. Good night.